wonder if you'd think of death differently if you thought of death as being gathered. Hey friends, it's Pastor Mike from Fellowship Church. Always enjoy connecting with you midweek. I hope you enjoy hot weather because we're getting a lot of it these days. It feels like August, not September, but I hope you're enjoying this beautiful weather outside. That question for you again, I wonder if you'd think of death any differently if you thought of death as being gathered. Now, friends, we're taking a few weeks in these midweek videos to talk a little bit about death. And if you're part of our fellowship worshiping family, you know that this past summer, we spent a good part of our summer studying a man named Abraham. He's one of the principal characters in the Old Testament. We spent some weeks just talking about his life and learning some God things from Abraham. But the interesting thing about Abraham is we're never introduced to him until he's in retirement years. We don't meet Abraham when he's younger or when he's a child. There's no stories there. But the story of Abraham actually ends with his death. We meet Abraham in Genesis 12, and then in Genesis 25, it tells us that Abraham died. It's interesting that God included that in the story and not his birth, just a thought. But the really cool thing about the story of Abraham in those last few verses is something that God includes in the story of Abraham's death. It says, Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age. I like that thought. And then it says he was an old man and full of years. Frankly, if I was writing that, I'd have left out the old man part and just said full of years. That sounds nice. And frankly, if that's all the story said about Abraham's death, we'd say, well, that sounds like something you'd put on a tombstone. Abraham breathed his last and died a good old man, full of years. It just sounds like a nice, lasting statement. But that's not all it says. It then says, and he was gathered to his people. Gathered? People? What in the world has that got to say about death? Well, friends, the word gathered is a word in the Bible that was more commonly used to describe a harvest. Now, let's talk about wheat in their day. Wheat grew on stalks, and when it was time for the wheat harvest, they would use a sickle or a scythe, and they would cut the wheat down. The stalks would lay on the ground. They would then collect all those stalks, bring them into the barn, and thresh them, and there would be a harvest of wheat, and that would be the completion of the process. But the important part is they gathered the stalks. They didn't just cut them down and leave them laying on the ground as though to say, the wheat stalks have come to the end of their useful life and now we're just going to leave them in the field. No. They gathered them. It's an agricultural term. They gathered them and brought them to where they belonged. So here's a thought. I wonder if you'd think of death any differently, as death being kind of the culmination of a process. Somebody was matured and they're now at the end of the process there. They're now gathered. They don't just drop and lay there. No. They're far too valuable for that. God says, I want to gather and bring to the final completion of this process here. God says, I am gathering you. But not just gathering, but the Bible tells us that Abraham was gathered to his people, meaning that others had gone on before him. They too had been gathered, and that God wasn't simply gathering Abraham alone. No. He was gathering Abraham to be with all of those who'd gone before him. Sometimes the Bible calls that a cloud of witnesses, another cool term. So friends, here's a thought about death. What if we thought of death as not just the end and the painful loss? What if we thought of death as the maturing of our life into the final stage, and God saying, you're far too valuable for me not to gather you and bring you to the rest of your people? I wonder if you'd think of death any differently if you saw that God was involved at the very end and taking us as we've matured and gathering us to his people. I don't know about you, but I think I'd grieve a little bit differently thinking that way. Friends, someday we're going to be gathered. That's a great thought. I hope that blesses you. It certainly blessed me as I was thinking about it. Hope you're having a wonderful week. Know that we love you, pray for you, caring about you, and grateful to be part of God's gathered people with you someday. Take care. God bless. Bye-bye.